My name is Walter Kowalski, and at 63 years old, I had made peace with the idea that the best chapters of my life were already written. My late wife, Patricia, had passed 4 years earlier, after 31 years of marriage, and the grief had settled into something quieter by then, not gone, just folded into the rhythm of daily life, the way scar tissue becomes part of the skin. I still got up every morning at 5:30. I still drove the same route to work. I still made 2 cups of coffee out of habit before remembering I only needed 1. I should tell you something about myself that almost nobody knew. I owned a small chain of hardware and building supply stores across southern Ontario, 3 locations. The first of which I had opened with Patricia back in 1994, with a loan from her father and more hope than sense. Over the years, through careful management, one reinvestment at a time, those stores had grown into something real. Kowalski Building Supply wasn't a household name the way the big box stores were, but contractors trusted us, tradespeople came back, and 3 generations of some families still walk through our doors. The business was incorporated under a numbered company, and the stores operated under the brand name. To anyone who didn't dig deeply, there was nothing connecting me, Walter, the guy in the shop apron, who knew where every fastener and fitting was kept to the ownership structure behind it. I had done this deliberately, at first just because Patricia and I were private people who didn't believe in announcing what we had. After she passed, I kept doing it for a different reason. I had watched too many widowers in my social circle get taken for rides by people who spotted vulnerability and money at the same time. My accountant, a cautious man named Bernard Osei, had told me plainly, "Walter, you are a target. The moment someone knows the size of your balance sheet, you become a project." I had taken those words seriously. So I came to work most days at the Ancaster location, the original store, the one Patricia and I had painted ourselves the first weekend we got the keys. I wore the same navy apron the staff wore. I helped customers find what they needed. I answered the phone. The employees knew I was the founder and owner, of course, but they were loyal people. Some of them had been with me 15 years, and they understood without being told that we didn't broadcast my role to strangers. That is how I met Diane. She came in on a Thursday afternoon in March, 2 years ago. She was looking for advice on renovating the mudroom of her house in Dundas, and she had that slightly overwhelmed look that people get when they realize a simple project has turned into a list of decisions they didn't anticipate. I walked her through the options. We talked about tile and moisture barriers and which adhesives held up in a Canadian winter. She laughed easily and asked good questions, and when she left she said, "You're the most helpful person I've ever met in a hardware store." It wasn't much, but it stayed with me. She came back 2 weeks later with more questions. Then she came back again, and that time she didn't really have questions, she just came in, I think. We talked for 40 minutes near the lumber racks, while my colleague Marcus pretended to be very busy counting inventory nearby, and later gave me a look that I chose to ignore. I asked her for coffee in April. She was 58, recently divorced after a 20-year marriage to a man she described as not unkind, just completely absent. She had 2 adult children, a son named Kyle who was 31 and worked in finance in Toronto, and a daughter named Amber who was 28 and lived nearby in Hamilton. She owned her home outright, worked part-time doing bookkeeping for a few small businesses, and seemed, in every way that mattered to me, like a grounded and genuine person. I told her I worked at the hardware store. I told her I had been with the company a long time and knew the operation well. Both of those things were true. I did not tell her the rest. I want to be honest about my reasons, because they were not simple. Part of it was caution, the same caution Bernard had drummed into me. Part of it was something more personal. After Patricia died, I had found that people treated me differently once they knew about the business. Conversations shifted. Invitations increased. I wanted, just once more, to have someone want to spend time with Walter Kowalski, the person, not Walter Kowalski, the asset. I told myself I would tell Diane the truth once I was sure. I just needed to be sure first. We dated through the spring and into the summer. She met my daughter, Rose, who was 35, and lived in Kitchener with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. Rose was cautious about Diane, not unkind, but reserved in the way that daughters can be when they are protecting a father they watched grieve for years. My son-in-law, Doug, was warmer and seemed to genuinely like her. Diane's son, Kyle, came to one dinner and was pleasant enough, if a little distracted by his phone. Amber I met twice, and she struck me as more attentive than her brother attentive, in a way I couldn't quite name at the time, as if she was cataloging information. By September, I had told Diane I loved her. By December, I was thinking about the future, in ways I hadn't allowed myself to think since Patricia's diagnosis. In January, on her birthday, I proposed. We were at a small restaurant in Dundas, just the two of us, and she cried and said yes, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 4 years. I had planned to tell her the full truth about the business that same evening. I had even rehearsed the words, but the night was so good, so uncomplicated, and I convinced myself I would do it the following weekend, when there was more time and less emotion in the air. I put it off. That was my mistake, and I own it. 3 days after the engagement, Diane had a conversation with Amber. I don't know exactly what was said. What I know is the sequence of events that followed, and I have had to reconstruct the rest from what I eventually learned. Amber had apparently done some research at some point, I don't know when, and had found public filings that showed Kowalski Building Supply had been doing well. She may have found the property records. She may have talked to someone. However she learned it, she knew more than her mother did, and she brought that knowledge to her brother Kyle. What happened next took about 2 weeks to unfold, and I only understood it fully in retrospect. It started with a lunch. Diane told me Amber and Kyle wanted to take me out to celebrate the engagement properly, just the 4 of us. We went to a steakhouse in Burlington. They were warm and congratulatory. Kyle asked me thoughtful questions about the hardware business, not aggressive questions, curious ones, or so they seemed. He asked how long I had been in the industry, whether the market was strong, whether the independent stores were holding up against the big chains. I answered honestly and generally. I said I had been in it a long time and that it had treated me well. Amber asked whether Diane and I had talked about what things would look like once we were married. I said we were in the early stages. She smiled and said that made sense, and the conversation moved on. I drove home that evening, feeling mildly uncomfortable, without being able to say exactly why. I called Bernard the next morning and told him about the dinner. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Walter, be careful." I told him I didn't have anything specific to point to. He said, "That's usually how it starts." 10 days after that dinner, Diane sat me down at her kitchen table with a look on her face that I had not seen before. It was not the face of the woman who had cried happy tears at the restaurant. It was careful and rehearsed and slightly removed, as if she had practiced what she was about to say and was now delivering it from memory. She told me that she and her children had been talking. She said that she had been doing some thinking about the future, about what a marriage at our age meant practically, not just emotionally. She said that she had come to feel that it would make sense, for clarity and for both our sakes, if I were to step back from my role at the hardware store. She said the business was clearly doing well, and that with the right management in place, I didn't need to be on the floor every day. She said she wanted us to travel, to spend real time together, to not have a business consuming our life as a couple. It sounded, on the surface, like someone who loved me and wanted my time. But then she put a folder on the table. Inside was a proposal. Kyle had apparently drafted it. The language was financial and precise in a way that did not sound like Diane. The proposal suggested that in anticipation of our marriage, I should sign over operational control of Kowalski Building Supply to a newly formed family trust, to be administered jointly. The trust structure listed Diane, Kyle, and Amber as co-trustees. There was a valuation of the business that I could see immediately was low, significantly low, and a suggested buyout figure for my shares that would have given me a fraction of what the business was actually worthwhile, transferring control entirely. The paper called it a retirement transition plan. It called the share transfer a gift of simplicity. I remember those phrases exactly because they made me feel cold in a way I hadn't felt since I stood in a hospital hallway and a doctor spoke words I didn't want to hear. I sat with the folder in my hands for a long moment. Diane was watching me with that careful expression. I could hear the refrigerator humming. Outside, a snowplow was making its way down her street. I asked her if she had read what was in this folder. She said yes. I asked her if she understood what it was proposing. She said it was about simplifying things. I asked her who had prepared it. She said Kyle had helped, because he understood these matters. I nodded slowly. I set the folder on the table. I said I would need some time to review it with my own people. She looked relieved, as if she had expected resistance and had gotten cooperation instead. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said she knew this was a lot, and that she just wanted us to start our life together on solid footing. I looked at her hand on mine and thought about the woman who had come into my store asking about tile for a mudroom. I genuinely could not tell, in that moment, how much of what had happened between us had been real. I drove home and called Bernard that night. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "The valuation they used, do you want me to tell you how far off it is?" I said yes. He told me. The number they had put on the business was less than 30% of its actual value. A transfer at that price, combined with the trust structure, would have effectively handed control of everything Patricia and I had built to 3 people who had known me for less than a year. Bernard said, "What do you want to do?" I said I needed a few days to think. I spent those days doing something I should have done months earlier. I had a lawyer review the proposal. I had a private investigator, something I had never done in my life, and felt strange run a background check on Kyle and Amber. I asked Marcus at the store, who had worked for me for 17 years and had better instincts than anyone I knew, what he had made of Diane when he met her. What I found was this. Kyle had been involved in 2 previous business disputes, both settled out of court, both involving accusations that he had misrepresented his role or interests in investment arrangements. Nothing criminal, but a pattern. Amber had previously been listed as a director of a numbered company that had dissolved under unclear circumstances. Diane's divorce settlement had apparently been complicated, with her ex-husband's lawyer raising concerns about asset concealment that were ultimately dropped. None of it was proof of anything. But taken together, it painted a picture of people who were comfortable with creative arrangements and less comfortable with straightforward ones. I called my daughter Rose that Thursday evening. She came over with Doug and I showed them the folder and told them everything, including the parts I was ashamed of, the months I had spent not telling Diane the truth, the way I had let myself want to believe in something so much that I had stopped asking the questions I should have been asking. Rose did not say I told you so. She sat across from me and said, "Dad, what do you need?" I told her what I was planning to do. The following Tuesday, I called Diane and told her I had reviewed the folder with my advisors and was ready to have a conversation. She asked if she should have Kyle join by phone. I said that actually, I would prefer we met in person, the 2 of us first, and that I would come to her. She agreed. She sounded encouraged. I arrived at her house at 2 in the afternoon. She had made tea. She had the folder on the coffee table. She asked if I had questions. I said I did. I took out a folder of my own. Inside was the actual corporate structure of Kowalski Building Supply, the numbered company, the full ownership record, the property holdings, including the 3 store locations, which were owned outright, not leased. There was the independent appraisal Bernard had commissioned years ago for estate planning purposes, updated recently, showing the real value. And there was a letter from my lawyer outlining what a transfer of control under the proposed trust structure would actually represent legally, including the tax implications and the fiduciary obligations involved. I watched Diane's face as she looked at the papers. The careful expression cracked. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person, but I could see the moment she understood the gap between what she had believed and what was true. And I could see something else. She had not, until that moment, known the full picture herself. Some of the surprise was genuine. Her children had been working with incomplete information too, or had kept her at a careful distance from the details. I said, calmly, that I wanted to be transparent with her about something. I said that I owed her that transparency, and that I was sorry I hadn't provided it sooner. I told her that I owned the business, that I had always owned it, and that I had chosen not to disclose that for reasons that were mine, and that I took responsibility for the confusion that had created. Then I told her that I could not sign what was in her folder. I told her that the valuation was incorrect, that the trust structure was inappropriate, and that the proposal had been drafted by someone with an interest in the outcome that was not aligned with mine. I told her that I had loved our time together and that I had wanted our future to be real. And I told her that I was no longer sure what was real. Diane put the folder down. She looked at her hands. She said, very quietly, that she hadn't known about Kyle's previous business situations. She said she had trusted him. She said the folder had been his idea and that she had gone along with it because he had framed it as protecting her. I believe her. I think that is the most painful part. I believe she was not entirely the architect of it. I think she is a woman who allowed herself to be steered by people she trusted, the same way I had almost been steered by people I wanted to trust. But love, at 63, cannot survive that kind of managed architecture. It needs something more honest than that. I stood up and I told her I needed to end the engagement. She didn't argue. She looked exhausted and a little smaller than she had when I walked in. I picked up my folder and I left. Kyle called me 2 days later. I let it go to voicemail. His message was businesslike. He said he thought we could still find a workable arrangement and that he hoped things could remain amicable. I forwarded the message to my lawyer and did not return the call. Amber sent a text to my personal number, which I found interesting since I could not remember giving it to her. It said simply, "I think you're making a mistake." I deleted it. I had my locks changed, not because Diane had a key to my house, but because the process of changing them felt like something I needed to do. A small, deliberate act of reclaiming the shape of my own life. In the months that followed, I threw myself back into the work. I walked the floor of the Ancaster store and the Stony Creek location, and the newer one in Brantford. I talked to contractors and tradespeople and young couples doing their first renovation on their first house. I drank coffee with Marcus and with my store manager in Stony Creek, a woman named Paulette, who had been with me nearly as long as Marcus had, and who, when I finally told her what had happened, shook her head slowly and said, "Walter, you need a dog. A dog will never try to put you in a trust." I got a dog, a 7-year-old beagle from a rescue in Guelph named Howard. Howard has no interest in my corporate structure and requires only that I walk him twice a day and share my toast in the mornings. Terms I find entirely reasonable. Rose and I grew closer that year than we had been since Patricia's illness. We had Sunday dinners most weeks, and my grandchildren got used to Howard accompanying me and then demanding attention in a way that disrupted meals pleasantly. Doug and I started watching hockey games together on Friday nights, something I hadn't done with anyone since a colleague from the early days of the business had moved west. And then, in the fall, about 8 months after everything had ended with Diane, I met Margaret. She came to the Ancaster store looking for materials for a garden project, raised beds, cedar framing, proper drainage. She was 61, recently retired from 22 years as a school principal, and she approached the hardware problem with the same organized precision she had probably brought to running a school. A list, clear questions, a willingness to be corrected, and a complete absence of pretension about what she didn't know. I spent nearly an hour helping her. Howard was in the store that afternoon, because it was a quiet Tuesday, and I sometimes brought him in, and he walked over to Margaret and sat down next to her foot, with the calm certainty of a creature who has decided something and sees no reason to debate it. Margaret looked down at him and said, "Well, hello." Then she looked up at me and said, "I think your dog just made a decision." We had coffee that week, then dinner. She told me about her career and her children, a daughter in Halifax, and a son in Ottawa, and her marriage, which had ended amicably 15 years earlier, two people who had grown in different directions without anger. She was funny and direct, and had no interest in being anything other than exactly what she was. On our third date, over dinner, at a quiet place in Ancaster, I told her everything. I told her about the business, and what it was worth, and how it was structured. I told her about Diane, and what had happened. I told her about Patricia and the 31 years and the 2 cups of coffee every morning. I told her all of it, including the parts where I had made mistakes. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she picked up her wine glass and looked at me and said, "Thank you for telling me all of that." Then she said, "For what it's worth, I came in to buy cedar. I don't need a numbered company. We are taking things slowly, and I am grateful for slow. I want to say something here to anyone listening who is in the later chapters of their life and wondering whether to open the door again after loss. Not about Diane, who I don't think of with bitterness, but about the things I learned that I wish I had known sooner. When you have built something over a lifetime, a business, a home, a financial foundation, that thing becomes a signal to certain kinds of people. Not all people, not even most people, but enough that you owe it to yourself to be clear-eyed. A background check is not a cynical act. Asking a lawyer to review a document before you sign it is not a failure of trust. It is the practice of a person who respects themselves and respects the relationship enough to keep it clean. A prenuptial agreement is not a prediction of failure. It is a conversation about honesty. And any person who recoils from that conversation, rather than having it openly, is telling you something important. Move slowly. Watch how a person treats the people who can do nothing for them. Watch how their family moves around your life, whether they draw close in the way of people who care for you or in the way of people mapping the territory. Trust your instincts when something feels managed. The feeling that a conversation has been rehearsed, that warmth is being deployed, rather than given, that feeling is information. I spent too many months ignoring information because I wanted a particular thing to be true. I am not sure I would have done differently. Knowing what I know now, grief makes you hungry for comfort and connection in ways that are entirely human and entirely understandable. But I could have moved more carefully. I could have been honest sooner about who I was. My silence, which I intended as protection, became a form of distance that let something grow in that space that I didn't put there. Tell the truth earlier. It protects you and it protects the other person, and it means that whatever is built between you is built on ground that can hold weight. Howard is asleep at my feet as I write this. The Brantford store had its best quarter last year. Rose and the kids are coming for Thanksgiving. Margaret and I are planning to drive out to Elora in the spring when the weather turns. I got up this morning and made 2 cups of coffee, and for the first time in 5 years, both of them were for someone who was in the kitchen with me. I set one down in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked out the window at the yard and said nothing for a while. And that silence was the most comfortable silence I had sat in since I lost Patricia. Some things take longer to find the second time. That does not mean they are worth any less. It may mean they are worth more.